Hello everyone and welcome back to where we sometimes talk about thrillers on Thursdays. My name is Katie and I have not posted in a couple months, so I'm excited to be back. Part of that is just life got busy and this is a hobby, so I just film when I'm in the mood, but also because I knew I was going to get a new camera for Christmas, so I hope that the video quality looks a lot better than it did in the past, and hopefully the audio is okay and all of that, so please let me know down below what you think. But today we're going to first talk about the 5 worst books I read in 2024, and then we're going to talk about the 5 best books I read in 2024. For all 10, of course, no spoilers. When I do worst and best, I'm going to start at number 5 for each and then work my way up to number 1. Same as the last few years, I also really want to film my 2025 TBR. So I've been reading kind of the new horror and thriller release lists that are coming out in the new year, but whether it's books or movies or TV shows, I think that would be fun as well. So please let me know if there are any that you're really excited about down below, and I will make sure to include them in that video. So let's go ahead and jump straight in. Let's get into the 5 worst books I read in 2024. Coming in at number 5 is Malibu Rising. And for each of these, I'll just give a really brief 1-sentence summary and then my spoiler-free thoughts. This is about Nina Riva, who is a talented surfer and model, and she hosts an epic end of summer party that brings her siblings together and reveals family secrets. This takes place, unsurprisingly, in California. I've enjoyed Taylor Jenkins Reid's other books. This is on this list, not because I thought it was poorly written. I love her writing. This, just in comparison to her other books, was a big letdown. I just found the plot of this to be incredibly dull. I wasn't interested in any of the characters. Plot-wise, again, just didn't love this. So I did not hate this book, but I'm just putting it at number 5 because it was a disappointment. At number 4 is Death in Her Hands. This follows Vesta Gull, who is a lonely widow who discovers a cryptic note in the woods about a murder that may or may not have happened, leading her on a surreal journey into paranoia and self-discovery. Now, I've read many of Otessa's other books. I loved Eileen. I loved My Year of Rest and Relaxation. I really hated Lapvona, is that what it was called? And I also just could not get into this. I thought the premise was really interesting. The thing that I will say going into this, unsurprisingly, just given the types of books she typically writes, this is not a thriller mystery about solving a murder. And I kind of figured that going into it. I knew it would be more of a character study, but even so, I think what it comes down to is, in general, she tends to write unlikable characters, but it just comes down to whether or not I'm personally interested in the character. Eileen, My Year of Rest and Relaxation, again, unlikable characters, but I was interested. Lapvona, I don't remember the name of the little boy who was the protagonist, but that little boy and Vesta, I just could not care about their characters, and these are character studies, so for that reason, I just did not enjoy it. At number 3 is First Lie Wins. I kept seeing this at top thriller lists. I don't remember if it came out in 2024 or maybe a year or two prior to that. But this is about a con artist living down south who's trying to, you know what, I'm not gonna say anything more because I don't remember what's a twist and what's revealed at the end of this. And part of the reason for that is why I disliked this. I thought this was just quite a forgettable book. I think if you're looking for a fast-paced beach read type thriller, I think it could be good for that. But there was just a huge amount of hype around this book. If you just look at the number of reviews for this on Goodreads, and I'm just a little bit surprised by it. Again, I didn't hate it. I just think that my expectations were too high. And again, I just think it's kind of a thriller beach read. This isn't anything heavy, and I think for some reason that's what I wanted out of this. So I think the problem with this is not necessarily the book, but maybe my expectations were just really off on this. At number 2 is Unmissing by Minka Kent. Our protagonist is Lydia, who was presumed dead for years, and she suddenly returns to her husband Luca's idyllic life, forcing him and his new wife Merritt to confront shocking truths and unravel their tangled connections. This is a thriller that had been on my TBR for years. I remember listening to a podcast years back, and the woman had recommended this and said it had a lot of really fun twists and turns, and just the idea that it's from the perspective of the new wife and the old wife, I can't speak, where again, the old wife who has disappeared for a decade has come back, I think was a really interesting premise. I love the setup for this book, and I think it could have been really good, but This is a very short book, and it deals with some very, very heavy topics, including things that happened to Lydia while she was missing, and it's just really breezed past. And I think my dislike for this is the same feeling I had around First Lie Wins, where I thought this book was going to be much deeper and darker than it was, especially given some of the subject matter. So just a trigger warning for a lot of things going into this, but everything is breezed past so quickly and nothing felt believable. So again, didn't hate it. If I hate books, I tend to just stop reading them. And I probably should have prefaced that before I went into this worst books list, although number one does not fit into that qualifier. So these are just books that didn't meet my expectations is maybe a better way of saying it. And at number one, this will not be a surprise for those of you who watched my video where I had ChatGPT pick the next book I should read based off other books that I've read and loved. I think it's a pretty fun video if you want to go ahead and watch it. I won't spoil everything I thought about this book, but I will spoil that video in the sense of what book was chosen because it ended up being the worst book I read in the year. So zero props to ChatGPT on choosing my next books, but it was The Girl Before. This takes place during two time periods, two perspectives. One is Jane, who moves into a minimalist house designed by this kind of famous and strange architect and discovers unsettling parallels between her life and the house's previous tenant, Emma. Again, I talk extensively about why I really, really disliked this book in that video, so I won't go through all of it here, but I did not like how he wrote about women. And again, I almost am at the point in life where I feel bad saying that I disliked these books in case for some reason the author came across this video. Again, nothing against him. It just really, really, even though I think I am the target audience for this, it was really not for me. So I'd be curious if you read this, especially since it was so popular, what you thought about it down below. Okay, enough on the negativity. We're gonna get into my 5 favorite books of 2025. And again, we're gonna start at number 5 and work our way up to number 1. And if I didn't already say, I would love to know what your least and favorite books were of 2024, so I can maybe add them to my 2025 TBR. So at number 5, I'm really cheating because I was really going back and forth between these 4 books, but I did choose one of the 4. But I was really deciding between, for number 5, either Incidents Around the House, Night Watching, or Nestlings, or Horror Movie. And I was really, really struggling, but in the end, I think I'm gonna go with Horror Movie by Paul Tremblay. And it surprises me a little bit that I'm going with this one, but when I think back on my reading experience of all of these, it really is the one that, again, I'm a little surprised it has stuck with me the most. This follows the Thin Kid, as he's called. It takes place in present day as well as back in time. And in the past, he has been cast in a movie by one of his, I think it was college or high school friends. And this movie stopped production, has a lot of really dark lore around it because many of the people from this movie, the making of it, the cast, the director, have died. And so the Thin Kid in present day is trying to make money going around to different horror conventions, and then he's reached out because they are going to remake Horror Movie. It's a little bit of a tricky one to summarize, but a lot of the themes and the imagery just really, really stuck with me. This was not a 5-star read. I would give it maybe 4 stars. Again, it's number 5 out of my 5 on this list. I don't think it's gonna be for everyone because the characters in general across the board are really, really unlikable. A lot of their motivations are not made very clear. So that's why also, even for me, I'm surprised out of those 4 I mentioned, it's the one that stuck with me the most, but I'm gonna keep it as number 5 for my 2024 list. Next up, finally, we've got some gothic horror because I just don't think there's enough of this out there. And that is Dowry of Blood. This is about Constanta, who is a woman saved from death and turned into a vampire by her husband. And throughout this book, she's recounting this centuries-long journey of love, betrayal, and reclaiming her autonomy. I read this one before seeing Nosferatu. I read this one quite a few months back, but if I had just seen Nosferatu and I wanted something to read that was also gothic, different themes in the movie, I would say, but if I wanted some dark gothic vampire-ness in my life, and if maybe you saw Nosferatu recently and want to read a book, again, plot very different, themes very different, the way vampires are in this book very different, but if you're just trying to scratch that itch, I do think this would be a good one. Although vampires are pretty in this book in the same way that they are in Twilight, it is a dark and deep vampire novel, which I haven't come across in a while, and it's also a pretty quick read. So again, if you love some gothic fiction, if you haven't read a good vampire book in a while, I highly recommend this one. At number 5 is a surprise for me because it is some fantasy, and that is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. This is about Emily Wilde, who is an eccentric and brilliant scholar in England. This is our world, but not in the sense that it's kind of back in time, but people know that fairies exist and that they're real, but a lot is unknown about them. So she is a researcher and scholar traveling to a remote village that's very snowy and dark and kind of creepy to research fairies and uncover mysteries and connections around them. This was, even though it is quite dark in some areas, I found it quite cozy. I really, really enjoyed the romance, and this one just really kind of swept me away into the world. I don't read a huge amount of series, so if you've read the next one, I have not yet, please let me know if it's as good as the first and if I should keep going. But this is just such a fun, heartwarming, and again, I say heartwarming, you're watching my channel, so it's not by any means lighthearted and cozy, but when I say cozy, I guess I just mean the area it takes place in, this kind of really snowy, dark village, is small. There's a little bit of romance. A lot of it takes place around fires and little cabins, even if they're not nice. And she's quite unhappy throughout the book. But this was just such a really pleasant surprise. So again, it is at number 3. At number 2 is Lone Women. This is historical horror, and it's about Adelaide Henry, who flees her troubled past to a homestead alone in Montana, carrying a mysterious trunk that holds a dangerous secret. This just hit all the check boxes, all the marks for me. I love Victor LaValle as an author. I've read, is it 1 or 2 of his books in the past and really loved those as well. But I don't read a lot of historical horror. So it's interesting learning around the history of, if you're Black and if you're a woman, how you could purchase land and what that process looked like. But the horror elements were also really, really scary. And this is one where I'm not typically someone who reads books and really pictures and wants them to be made into movies. Not that I don't, it's just not something that crosses my mind a lot. But this is one where I think this would be an incredible movie or maybe mini series on HBO. I also thought Adelaide was a really interesting main character because I think you'll find yourself rooting for her in some areas and maybe really disliking other things that she does. So she's really multifaceted. And at number 1 is one of the first books that I read in 2024, and that is Bright Young Women. This is a really fascinating way to write a book because it's about Ted Bundy and the trial and the history around his killings, but it is from the perspective of Pamela, who is a determined sorority president, and it takes place in the past and present, as Pamela is there the night a lot of the killings happen at the sorority that she runs, and the aftermath years later as well. This is such an interesting take on Ted Bundy, and I almost don't like that I'm saying his name over and over again because very intentionally, his name is never mentioned throughout the book. And it's also really focused on how misogynistically as a society we've framed him as this really smart and intelligent serial killer who is just able to fool all these women into helping him. And it kind of gets at how as a society we gave him really too much credit and he really was not that intelligent and just a lot of other kind of interesting pieces. It's much more focused on Pamela. And again, it's just not like anything else that I've read. This is not a fast-paced thriller. So I just want to be clear about that. The first little tiny chunk of the book, when the killings happen at the sorority, is really terrifying. The rest of it is just more so about the aftermath. So just know that going into this is not a dissection of Ted Bundy, the person. This is not a thriller. This is just a really interesting way to view the history and maybe how we as a society chose to view him. If you look at the facts, we kind of missed the mark on how we're characterizing him these days. So those are my 5 worst and 5 books that I read in 2024. Again, please let me know what some of your favorite and least favorites were. I also wanted to give an honorable mention. I don't have the physical copy of the book because it's at my parents' house, but my dad, Dad, if you're watching this video, and I'll tell him to, he had been asking me to read The Legacy of Hero for literally years. He gave me this copy again. The actual physical book is at home with him, but I finally read it. I just don't read a huge amount of sci-fi. I didn't put this on this list because it wasn't a favorite and it wasn't a least favorite either, but this is a really cool horror sci-fi book that is one of his favorite books of all time. So I just wanted to give him a little bit of a shout out here because he reads even more than I do. He reads a lot of intense sci-fi and fantasy. But this was written, I want to say in the 70s or 80s, 1987. And it's about a group of people who are setting up a society on a different planet and some monsters that start attacking them. But it's really gruesome and violent. Some aspects I think should be rewritten for 2024 is all I'll say. But please let me know if you have any other kind of horror sci-fi recommendations, what you would recommend, because it's not a genre that I go into very much. And thank you, Dad, again, for lending me this, and glad I finally read it. That is everything I had for you. If you're not doing anything tonight and you want to watch an obscure horror movie, that is the last video I filmed, a bunch of underrated obscure horror movie recommendations. So feel free to check that out if you'd like. But I'm very happy to be back, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.